27 minutes to 8 a.m. I'm Arnold Sagawa. You're still watching Morning at NTV. Let's move into some research space. In the wake of COVID-19, a lot of economies have revised their growth projections. Uganda, no exception, moving a GDP growth projection from close to 6% earlier on to between, well, 2.5 to 3.5%. But where are the employers and the employees in this picture? To give us a sense of what all of this means for employability, we have a researcher, Ethan Musolini, to just walk us through an interesting paper he just penned together with another team. Ethan, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Success Africa, definitely. Just walk us through this particular research. What are some of the main findings before we break it down?
All right, so thanks for inviting me this morning. And when we did this research, what we were looking for, just to give you perspective, is when the lockdown happened, we were asking ourselves, what's going to happen with businesses? What's going to happen with the managers? What's going on when it comes to, say, the productivity at home? Because we noticed a couple of things, and we knew that because there was a sudden change, we wanted to know, are people prepared for this kind of environment? And just so you know, I'm a CEO of Success Africa. I'm into human resource consulting and training. I do motivational speaking and coaching. But of course, because we're interested in the performance and these other organizations on how they have been working throughout the time, so we're keen to discover this data. So here are some of the highlights that we noticed. 56.6% of business performance are not being achieved. And, only 15.1% of the entrepreneurs noted that business performance remained the same. And what's also interesting is that of the 59 managers we interviewed, 57% are continuing some organizational activities, while 32% are fully operational, and 11% are completely closed. Now, but when it comes to the managers, the other statistic that really caught our attention was that majority of the managers, 49%, were finding it difficult adjusting to work from home. Only 37% found it easy, and 6% found it very, very difficult. Now, when it comes to team performance, they noticed that team performance dropped, at least about 30 or so percent, not 30 or so percent. A huge, in terms of productivity, if I may pull up the stats, in terms of productivity, we noticed that there was a huge drop also in terms of productivity at home because there was a challenge with that because of people were not ready to work from home.
Right. Ethan, when you talk about productivity, how do you quantify productivity? Because are you looking at man hours? Are you looking at yields? What is the metric here to gauge productivity? Because let's face it, it's very common for someone to wake up, go to the office here in Uganda, or even other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, just use the biometric. Everyone sees that you've arrived at the office, you sign in the book, you go on, and you're on Facebook the whole day. So how do you gauge productivity in this research? Doesn't that limit your research in a certain manner?
So that's a fantastic question, because at the end of the day, when we're asking about productivity, the manager or the leaders, and of course we had a database based on the years we've been acting as human resource consultants and trainers. Productivity is relative, because I will tell you that in some cases, or you'll find that, for example, let's say for you who is in the news media, productivity might mean how many stories have you produced in a day. So for us, productivity, it was relative based on the manager's perspective or the leader's perspective. So if, for example, someone was meant to make 20 phone calls a day or 100 phone calls a day, how many were they producing in that time frame? So they are a manager. If they have been tracking, then they are able to tell. But in this case, productivity is based on the key performance indicators, targets or objectives that each employee has in the moment.
Right, there's a stat here that's quite interesting. The study does find that 56% of business performance is not being achieved, while 15.1% of entrepreneurs noted that business performance remained quite the same. Now, what does this tell you vis-a-vis entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial spirit of Uganda? There's many studies that have suggested that Ugandans are up there in the top 5 across the world when it comes to entrepreneurship, and now we're seeing quite a huge gap, 56 and 15. What does this inform? What does this allude to?
So come again, I didn't get about that entrepreneurship and in Uganda and all that.
Right.
Come again,
So
that front.
your study does show that 56% of business performance is not being achieved, while 15.1% of entrepreneurs noted that business performance remained the same. So
Yes.
business performance on one end, but on the entrepreneurship side, I'm thinking the 56 was more on the former end, but on the entrepreneur side, it's just 15.1. Now, this huge gap, what does that allude to, or even attest vis-a-vis former employment and entrepreneurship? Does it speak to something?
Well, I'm yet to pick up. So when we say business performance, this was based on now still on the stats for the entrepreneurs we spoke to. So meaning indeed that is still the same category. So indeed there was so for some, there are some businesses that where the performance stayed more or less the same. And so that's what it is. Of course, there are businesses that were hugely hit because we know at least across the board, we noticed that over 85% of, in terms of business generation and all that, they were heavily or gravely affected in this particular event.
Right. So you also do discover that close to 32% of the people you actually interviewed, this is of course the businesses and the SMEs, are fully operational, while 11% are fully closed. I want you to speak to this in light of the daunting news that we heard very, very recently from the Trade Minister, alluding to the fact that close to 4,200 businesses, or should I say manufacturers, might be looking at closure due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Does this speak to this particular figure, or are we overselling the 4,200?
Well, I need to listen to the those particular figures of potential closures and all that. What I can say for certain is that we haven't fully experienced the full force of the current crisis because we are just in the initial stages. Because you see, people are getting to the reality of what's happening at the moment. So even these figures we are talking about in terms of closure and the like, because I told you the other stat that I highlighted is that at least 85 point, because of just picking up a few stats here, when you read through the full report, which I forwarded, you'll notice that at least over 85% of businesses feel that they were greatly affected. So these closures, I know they are going to happen. And the question though is what we also need to pay attention to besides business, if we expand this in terms of productivity, 64% of the employees interviewed said that they were not trained on how to work productively from home. So that speaks volumes in that as people are working from home, even minus businesses closing, even for those who are working from home, how are they productive? Most of them don't know. Most of them don't know how to use the tools to work from home. So there is a huge need here in that when we talk about lockdown, when people are at home, if they are not prepared, then they are not going to deliver. So that's the other segment that we are not paying attention to. And we know, for example, people are being stressed and they have all these worries on their minds because over 77% of the worries in terms of people's, when we talk to the managers, they say it's over 77% in terms of the number one challenge that their employees were worried about is job security. So if people are worried about their job security, for example, you think about their levels of productivity. We know from experience, whenever an organization is, say, planning to downsize or there's any huge challenge and people have all these worries about themselves, productivity dramatically goes low. So as we are talking about Labor Day here, we need to think about the employees. How are we preparing them? Because with these worries in them, we need the big challenge I also see coming up is the issue around mental health. The stress, the fears, the worries, what's going to happen next. People are worried about their jobs, they're worried about their families, and all this. Not only does it affect their performance, but also their health, well-being, and hence productivity. So besides, it's not just the closure of offices. I'm more worried about the closure of the minds, of their hopes, of their dreams, of their concerns, and their mental health.
Ethan, I'm very disturbed by some of these findings because let's take, you interviewed 272 employees. 64% of those say they're not adequately oriented to work from home, like you've actually mentioned. If I delve deeper into the age bracket of your sample space, we're looking at an interesting figure. Actually, it's very good. Majority, which is 47.3% of the respondents, are aged between 25 and 35. Now, I want to connect that to the fact that you also say a majority, a considerable number of the employees say they had no skills in most of the technology. We're looking at Asana, Podio, Slack, Office 360. Now, if an age bracket of 25 to 35 cannot operate Slack or Office, I am extremely worried what our parliamentarians might be thinking, because let's face it, they're not in that particular age bracket.
And indeed that's the reality we are facing. I don't want to jump into the MP side.
Well, maybe that was a bad example.
But I get your point. And again, that also shocked us, to be honest, because then if that is the age bracket, and that's the majority of the people who are in the working class, so to speak. So if they don't know, so part of what we are highlighting as consultants, we are saying, look, this is the reality on the ground. We need to prepare. If you're not preparing your team to use these tools, for example, and now we've spent it's over a month now in the lockdown. So that alone explains to you why there's a huge challenge, because if people don't know how to use the tools, it's like sending someone to the gardens to do farming, and they don't know how to use the hoe, they don't know how to pull the weeds. Or the weeds might be there, or there's something to be done, but they have the hoe and we have access to these tools now. But if we don't know how to use the tools, there's a huge challenge, there's a huge gap. And our hope was that this research would bring these realities to bear, because before, you had your laptop, you're given stuff to do directly face-to-face. And I also know the other thing I wanted to highlight is that based on the history of pandemics, usually the second or third wave is the bigger one. So for me, even if we release even when we get out of the lockdown, what happens when there's a second lockdown? What happens when there's a third lockdown? So we are saying you need to prepare your staff members. And the other thing we also notice is that a good percentage also, when you look through the numbers, is that the people out there, the staff members, don't feel enough support from their supervisors or managers. So if that's the case, then what happens if you're not getting enough support, you don't know how to use the tools, then what happens to your productivity? Boom, goes low. So for me, there is an urgent need here for the managers, the leaders to pay attention to this. And also it means government will have to ideally also think, how do we boost the ICT skill area? Because if a lot of stuff is going to go online, at least in moments like this, even if we go fully online, I know that it's extremely useful to use these kinds of tools.
Ethan, let's touch a question that researchers like yourself are always terrified of when they put such research forth. Walk me through the limits of this particular study.
So some of the limits, of course, was one, because of the current lockdown. I mean, people's concern is around, where do I get food? Where do I get a job? When is the business opening again? So when they receive a phone call, the last thing they want to do is to hear about this kind of research. So we had that challenge. The second challenge we had, of course, is that we were two firms. As Success Africa, we partnered with Ultimate Multimedia. So we were quite limited in terms of resources to reach out to as many people as possible in this perspective. The third challenge we had, of course, was the timeline, because we wanted this to see what's happening during this lockdown. It's not like when you have, say, a full year to make all this research. So all those were some of the limitations in the moment. So we had time constraints, financial resource constraints, and of course the psychological constraints of the people you're getting data from in this particular aspect. But having said that, we believed also that, you know what, it's better. I believe in progress is better than perfection. So for example, some of this numbers we picked up in terms of people not getting enough support, or how many people know how to use these tools. All these are profound insights which we feel will inform human resource managers, CEOs, MDs, entrepreneurs, to see how they can actually prepare their teams to deliver work, to do their very best.
Is this fully funded by Success Africa, or there are other partners? Very briefly on that.
It's just us as Success Africa and Ultimate Multimedia. Those are the only two firms. And so our hope and prayer is that if other partners develop interest in this kind of research, they could partner with us, and then we broaden the research, deepen it, because we know that this is just the beginning. This is just an eye-opener in terms of what's out there and what needs to be done.
Right. Ethan, if we're to have this blown up and think more regionally, there's another study that you allude to that was done by, I think it's Consumer Insights Africa in Kenya, that showed that close to 80% of the respondents did record or report a dip in their productivity. Now, if I'm looking at your numbers...
Come again, that 80% did what?
80% of the interviewed reported a reduction in productivity as a result of the COVID-19 lockdowns. Now, if I'm to contrast the findings of the research in Kenya on productivity and ultimately adaptability, and compare that to your findings, I could easily say, you know what, maybe we're not so bad. You know, the situation in Kenya is way dire.
Well, because we know that at least 50%, if I need to pull up the figures here, so to make sure that I'm quoting the exact numbers in terms of the productivity, because we know that whereas the 80% in Kenya, and here we know at least a huge percentage dropped by a half. So if that's the case, and I need to pull up the figures here, so to make sure that I'm quoting the exact numbers, I don't want to quote the wrong numbers, and then you say, okay, this is what you said. When you look at the productivity of the people here in Uganda, still it was heavily hit, so to speak. And let me see. I have, in terms of work operations, we know, just need to look at the employee needs, working from home. So number one, apart from the majority of managers finding it difficult to work from home and finding it 37 finding it easy, that alone means a huge percentage is affected. 37% in terms of the people we interviewed in terms of team performance, 37 dropped by a half. Okay. Then they said 9% said not much is being achieved. Only 32% said remain the same. Yeah, when you compare with Kenya, you might say, okay, we are not so bad, but still, I mean, if at least 37% has dropped by a half, okay, and it's only 32% where the productivity remained the same. So for me, that is still huge. In terms of performance, that's huge. It's because you're talking about close to 70% still, if only 32% remain the same. So it means at least 68% dropped, okay? But what's also caught my attention is that there is a 4% where the performance doubled. Now that could be, say for online delivery services, or let's say people who are dealing with, say health. It could be people who are engaged in products and services, let's say creating masks. There the business doubled. So home deliveries definitely shoot through the roof. But then at least you're talking about 68%. If the performance went lower, that's still a huge concern that we need and definitely have to pay attention to, in my view.
Ethan, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Let alone the fact that I think the other thing that's very striking about your study is close to 50.8% of the respondents are female. And thank you for observing the gender parity. Ethan Musolini, CEO of Success Africa, just walking us through these latest study. Very interesting stuff, adaptability. I'm sure you can get it on their website. Let's take a quick break. It's just 5 minutes to 8 a.m. We'll be back with more Morning at NTV after this.